Entire cities once flourished with no written laws or police. We will explore 28 forgotten frameworks that made this possible. By the end, you will understand how societies maintained perfect order through spoken traditions and shared beliefs alone. How did a marketplace function without written contracts, and what kept neighbors from conflict without courts to appeal to? What does it take for a community to govern itself purely through trust and memory? The city of Uruk thrived on a framework of sound, not script. Beneath the towering ziggurats, it was the elder's voice that carried the weight of law, reciting codes of conduct memorized over a lifetime. These spoken traditions governed everything from the price of grain to the boundaries of a family's land. Imagine a marketplace dispute not settled by a contract, but by a public oath sworn before witnesses, the merchant's reputation resting entirely on his spoken word. This was a justice system built on memory and social pressure, where the entire community acted as both witness and enforcer. Archaeologists studying these ancient societies point to a powerful psychological effect. Hearing the rules recited aloud, generation after generation, forged a powerful shared identity. It was not a distant authority imposing order, but the community itself upholding the norms it had collectively memorized. Dispute resolution happened in the open during public assemblies where elders would listen and then recite the relevant tradition, restoring balance through a verdict everyone understood. This reliance on the spoken word required incredible feats of memory. Storytellers and elders were not just entertainers or leaders, they were the living libraries of their civilization, using rhythm, rhyme, and narrative to preserve complex guidelines. Can you picture a world where your entire understanding of right and wrong, of fair trade and neighborly conduct, was held not in a book or on a screen, but in the stories your grandparents told you? This collective memory created a society deeply invested in its own stability, because every citizen was a guardian of the rules. The success of Uruk and its neighbors proves that law can be a living conversation, a framework that breathes with the voices of its people, long before a single word was ever carved into stone. But this reliance on the human voice had its limits. Far across the continent, another powerful framework was taking root, one woven not just from spoken words but from the very bonds of blood. In the fertile lands of the Yellow River Valley, entire villages were governed by the unshakable principles of the clan. Your identity, your responsibilities, and your place in the world were all defined by your family lineage. The rules were not written down because they were lived every single day, passed from parent to child through the sacred practice of ancestral customs. At the heart of this system was filial piety, a deep-rooted respect for one's elders and ancestors that formed the bedrock of social order. A dispute between neighbors was not a matter for a police force, but a family matter to be settled by the clan leader, who would mediate based on unwritten precedents remembered from generations past. Ancient texts like the Classic of Rites describe this world, stating that harmony in the family was the root of harmony in the state. The entire social structure was a mirror of the family, extending outward. Decision-making happened through clan councils, where elders gathered not to debate and vote, but to seek consensus. These meetings were often solemn rituals, intertwined with ceremonies to honor the ancestors, blending governance with spiritual practice. The agricultural cycle itself was part of this framework. The planting and harvest seasons dictated the rhythm of community life, and the fair distribution of water and grain was managed through clan agreements, ensuring every family had what it needed to survive. At the ancient settlement of Bantu, archaeological evidence shows homes arranged around a central communal hall, with storage pits for grain that suggest a collective approach to resources. No one needed a written contract for their share of the harvest. Your kinship guaranteed it. The elder of the clan was more than a leader. He was a living moral authority. His wisdom respected precisely because it reflected the accumulated experience of the lineage. Can you feel the strength of a society built on that kind of mutual obligation, where your primary duty was to your family and your ancestors? Yet, this system also had its constraints. Its strength was also its greatest weakness. Loyalty to your own clan could easily turn into suspicion or even conflict with a neighboring clan. As these family groups grew larger and more powerful, the simple, kinship-based rules began to strain, evolving slowly into the complex cultural frameworks that would eventually build dynasties. These sprawling Minoan palaces were not just royal homes, they were the beating heart of an entire economy, all operating on a silent, unwritten code. Within the labyrinthine corridors of Knossos, vast storerooms held enormous clay jars of olive oil, wine, and grain, the collective wealth of the community. There were no written laws dictating who got what. Instead, a sophisticated system of redistribution managed by priest-kings ensured that every craftsperson, farmer, and laborer received their share. How did such a complex operation function without a single written contract? The answer lies not in scrolls of parchment, but in art and symbol. Intricately carved seal stones were pressed into wet clay to mark ownership and authenticate transactions. Vibrant frescoes on the palace walls depicted processions of people bringing offerings, visually reinforcing everyone's role in this grand economic machine. These images were a constant public reminder of the social contract, a daily lesson in civic duty painted for all to see. The system's stability was deeply tied to ritual. Grand religious festivals were not merely spiritual events, they were essential economic engines. During these ceremonies, the priest-kings would oversee the distribution of goods, transforming a simple allocation of resources into a sacred act. A trade agreement with a foreign merchant was not signed. It was sealed with a ceremonial exchange of gifts and a shared libation, an oath made to the gods that carried more weight than any written promise. This entire framework thrived on communal trust, meticulously built and maintained through these shared symbolic experiences. There were no legal courts because disputes were settled within the context of this shared belief system, mediated by the same palace administrators who managed the storerooms. Can you see the elegant logic? The rules were not read, they were performed, they were worn as seals, and they were painted on the walls for constant reinforcement. This artistic approach to governance reveals a profound creativity, proving that order can be woven into the very fabric of a culture's visual and ritual life, creating a stable, thriving city without a single written law. Across the sea in the fog-draped north, entire communities gathered not in palaces but on windswept plains. In early medieval Europe, the open-air assembly known as the Thing was the beating heart of Germanic governance. Picture free men from surrounding villages converging at a designated ring of stones, their voices rising in debate under the open sky. There were no kings or tyrants here to impose their will, only the collective wisdom of the community, guided by the ancient customs recited from memory. A law speaker, a man chosen for his prodigious memory, would stand and recite the law, his voice carrying the weight of generations. This was not a rigid, unchanging code, but a living tradition that could adapt to new circumstances through public consensus. Every man had the right to speak, to bring a grievance, or to argue for a new interpretation. How could such a system prevent chaos without a police force to enforce its will? The answer lay in the power of reputation. A verdict reached by the assembly carried immense social weight, and to defy it was to risk becoming an outcast, severed from the protection and trade of the entire community. Enforcement was a communal responsibility where honor and social standing were the ultimate currency. These gatherings were deeply intertwined with mythology, as the law itself was seen as a sacred gift from the gods like Odin. Procedures for raising an issue were formal and solemn, often beginning with an oath sworn on a weapon or a sacred ring. The goal was rarely punishment but restoration. The Icelandic sagas are filled with stories of blood feuds resolved through negotiated compensations, where a price was set for a life lost and paid in goods or silver, restoring balance and preventing endless cycles of violence. Historians point to this system as a remarkable form of participatory democracy, one that effectively prevented any single chieftain from concentrating too much power. It was governance as a continuous dialogue, a framework built on the principle that the rules belong to everyone. Can a society truly govern itself through conversation and shared honor? The Thing assemblies stand as a powerful testament to that very idea, proving that justice can be a process owned by the people, spoken aloud for all to hear and uphold. Yet even the open debate of the Thing assembly relied on the voices of men. In the vast expanse of the Pacific, a different kind of power held entire islands in balance, one spoken not by the community but by the gods themselves. The Polynesian Kapu systems wove a web of sacred prohibitions that dictated every aspect of life, from the food you could eat to the shadows you could cast. These were not laws written on parchment, but oral proclamations made by chiefs and priests, believed to carry the direct sanction of the divine. A violation was more than a social misstep. It was an offense against the spiritual order, inviting catastrophic punishment from the gods. This framework created a society where fear and faith were the ultimate enforcers. The alii, or chiefs, acted as the living interpreters of these kapu, their pronouncements governing resource use with a startling foresight. Oral histories tell of strict seasonal bans on fishing for certain species or on harvesting specific plants, decrees that were enforced not by gods, but by the terrified conviction that breaking them would cause the oceans to empty or the forests to wither. Can you sense the profound environmental wisdom embedded in this spiritual fear? It was a system of sustainability enforced by the threat of divine retribution, ensuring that no one would dare take more than the ecosystem could provide. The proclamation of a new kapu was a grand ceremonial event, often held at a sacred heiau or temple site, where the chief's word became an unbreakable decree. This reinforced a rigid social stratification, as certain kapu applied only to commoners, while others governed the nobility, creating visible markers of status and power. For instance, certain foods were kapu for all but the alii, and a commoner stepping on the shadow of a chief could face death. This was not a system of equality, but one of order, where everyone knew their place because the gods had supposedly ordained it. The entire community became self-policing, bound by a shared belief that their collective survival depended on obeying these unseen rules. The Kapu system demonstrates how a framework can fuse the spiritual with the intensely practical, governing an entire civilization through a powerful, unwritten code of sacred permission and forbidden act. Deep in the heart of a traditional Bantu village, a person was not an island, but a vital strand in a living web. The governing principle was Ubuntu, a profound philosophy that translates simply as "I am because we are." This was not a slogan, but the very bedrock of society, a framework where communal interdependence and moral reciprocity replaced any need for written law. A leader here did not inherit power through birthright alone, but earned it through demonstrated wisdom and a generosity of spirit that served the entire community. When conflicts arose, they were not settled in a courtroom with a judge and jury, but in gatherings known as palavas. These were long, patient discussions where every person had a voice, and the primary goal was not to assign blame or deliver punishment, but to restore harmony and heal the fractured relationship. The process was a masterclass in consensus building, guided by elders who acted as mediators, not dictators. Their role was to listen intently and weave together the threads of testimony until a shared truth emerged, one that the entire community could accept and uphold. Wisdom was often conveyed through the elegant shorthand of proverbs and oral poetry, compressing generations of insight into a single, memorable phrase. A saying like, "A person is a person through other people," would be invoked not as a lecture, but as a gentle reminder of the fundamental connection binding everyone present. This human-centered approach created immense social resilience. Pre-colonial kingdoms like Great Zimbabwe operated on these very principles. Vast trade networks and complex diplomatic relations were conducted not with signed treaties, but on the strength of a handshake and the shared understanding that your own well-being was inextricably linked to the well-being of your partner. Can a society built on such a powerful sense of mutual care actually function? The thriving, centuries-long legacy of these communities suggests it not only functioned, but flourished, offering a timeless challenge to our modern notions of justice and community. This was a framework that measured its success not in convictions, but in the strength of its human bonds. High in the Andes, the Inca Empire stretched across impossible terrain, yet its stability relied on a principle of mutual obligation, not written command. The Mita system was the engine of this civilization, a rotating labor duty that every household owed to the state. Imagine a community where your annual tax was not paid in gold or grain, but in the work of your own hands, building the roads and terraces that connected and fed the empire. This was not forced servitude in the modern sense, but a deeply ingrained social contract, an unwritten agreement between the people and their ruler, the Sapa Inca. Local leaders or curacas were responsible for organizing these labor drafts, ensuring every family contributed its fair share to vast public projects. The entire framework operated on a principle of reciprocity. The state provided security and organized feasts, and in return, the communities provided the labor that built their collective world. How could such a sprawling empire keep track of these complex obligations without a single written word? The answer hangs from strings. Administrators used the quipu, an intricate device of knotted cords, where the position, type, and number of knots recorded vast amounts of data, from population counts to labor quotas. This was a binary system of memory, a tactile database that allowed the empire to function with breathtaking efficiency. But the system was not cold and calculating. It was woven into the fabric of spiritual life. Major Mita projects were often timed with religious festivals, transforming backbreaking work into a communal celebration and an act of devotion. The rhythmic pounding of stones to terrace a mountainside would be accompanied by music and ceremony, linking the labor directly to the worship of Intai, the sun god. Participation was thus motivated by both social duty and divine favor. What happened to those who tried to avoid their turn? There were no prisons for such offenses. The primary penalty was social ostracism, a devastating consequence in a society where community was everything. To be shunned was to lose your place in the web of mutual support, a punishment far more effective than any fine. The stunning citadel of Machu Picchu itself stands as a monumental testament to this system. Its precisely fitted stones laid by thousands of hands, each fulfilling their Mita duty. Can our modern concepts of volunteerism and community service capture the power of such a collective endeavor? The Mita system proves that a society can achieve architectural and organizational marvels not through the threat of written law, but through the binding power of a shared, unwritten promise. While the Inca relied on collective labor, the Celtic peoples of Ireland wove their social order from a different thread, the intricate and poetic memory of the Brehon laws. For centuries, these complex legal principles governed every aspect of life, from property disputes to contracts and crimes, yet they were never written down in a formal codex. Instead, they lived in the minds and on the tongues of the Brehons, a class of professional jurists who memorized the law in vast, rhythmic verses. Their training was a monumental feat, taking place in special oral schools where students would spend years internalizing the subtle nuances of custom and precedent through poetic recitation. A legal ruling was not a dry document, but a performance where the Brehon would publicly recite the relevant verses to resolve a dispute, his authority stemming from his flawless command of this inherited wisdom. The ancient text known as the Senchus Mór describes this system, stating that the law was sustained by the memory of the elders and the tradition of the poets. This was a justice system deeply interwoven with art, where the same class of learned individuals often served as both poets and judges, using the power of language and meter to make the law memorable, beautiful, and binding. How do you enforce an agreement without a written contract to point to? The Brehons employed a sophisticated system of sureties, where respected members of the community would act as guarantors, putting their own honor and property on the line to ensure the terms were fulfilled. Your social status directly influenced the compensation you were due or the penalty you would pay, creating a legal framework that was deeply personalized and context-dependent. Irish myths are filled with kings and heroes consulting Brehons to settle bitter conflicts, not with the swing of a sword, but with the recitation of a just verse. This highlights a fascinating intersection where art met justice, and where the stability of society depended on the clarity of a poet's memory. The endurance of the Brehon laws for over 1,000 years stands as a powerful testament to the capacity of the human mind to hold and administer a complex legal system, proving that order can be composed not in ink, but in the living, breathing poetry of a people. The steppe winds carried laws as binding as any carved in stone. Across the vast grasslands of Central Asia, nomadic empires rose to power on a framework of spoken decrees and deep-seated custom, a system where the entire social order was built for motion. For tribes like the Mongols and Scythians, the unwritten code known as Yassa was the law of the land, proclaimed by leaders and etched into memory. A great Khan like Genghis would issue oral proclamations governing everything from military strategy to the rules of trade, his personal authority giving the words immediate force. How could a leader command loyalty across such immense distances without a single written order? The answer lay in the cultural bedrock of the steppe, a set of norms that prized loyalty to the clan, the skillful sharing of scarce resources, and an unparalleled mobility. Anthropologists point to this as a masterclass in adaptive governance, where the system itself had to be as fluid as the people it served. At the heart of this political life was the Kurultai, a grand assembly of tribal leaders. This was not a permanent parliament, but a mobile council called when major decisions were needed, from electing a new Khan to declaring war. There were no elaborate buildings or bureaucratic offices, just a temporary gathering on the open plain where consensus was forged through debate and oratory. Communication across the empire relied on powerful symbols. A horsetail standard raised high could signal a call to arms, its message visible from miles away and understood by every rider on the horizon. This governance was deeply infused with the spiritual world. Shamans were essential advisors, interpreting the will of the eternal blue sky, and sanctifying the decisions of the Kurultai. A new law was not just a political act, it was a spiritual one, blessed by the unseen forces that governed the wind and the weather. The penalties for breaking this trust were severe, yet required no prisons. The ultimate punishment for betrayal or theft was often exile, a fate worse than death on the steppe, as it meant being cut off from the clan, the only source of protection and survival in a harsh land. Even the most critical resource, pastureland, was managed through this oral framework. Complex seasonal agreements between tribes dictated who could graze their herds where and when, preventing conflict and ensuring no single area was overgrazed. These were handshake deals that held empires together, a testament to the power of a spoken promise in a world where your word was your bond. Can a society today, so reliant on written contracts and fixed addresses, even comprehend the strength required to build an empire on trust and mobility? The nomads did not just live by this code, they conquered half the known world with it, proving that the most powerful frameworks are often those that are carried in the heart and spoken on the wind. A leader's power was measured not by what he kept, but by what he gave away. Along the misty coasts of the Pacific Northwest, a complex system of governance unfolded not in courtrooms, but during magnificent feasts known as potlatches. These elaborate ceremonies were the legal and economic bedrock of societies like the Kwakwaka'wakwa, where the act of giving became a binding contract and a tool of justice. A chief would invite rival clans and neighboring villages to a great gathering, displaying his wealth and then distributing it with calculated generosity, offering piles of woven blankets, carved copper plates, and food. This was not simple charity, it was a powerful strategic move. By giving away vast amounts of resources, a host demonstrated his capacity for leadership and gained immense social influence. Every gift created a debt of obligation, weaving a web of social and political alliances that held the community together. The oratory during these events was a precise legal instrument. Elders would stand and speak, their words weaving together history, genealogy, and the specific terms of new agreements. A promise made during a potlatch, witnessed by the entire community, carried the weight of an unbreakable vow. How could such a system resolve a bitter land dispute? Instead of filing a lawsuit, the involved parties would bring their case to a potlatch. Through days of feasting, speech-making, and ceremonial gift-giving, a resolution would be negotiated. The host, perhaps a neutral chief, might grant significant wealth to one party, effectively purchasing their agreement and restoring harmony, with the entire community acting as witness and enforcer. This framework was brilliantly self-policing. To break a promise made at a potlatch was to face profound social shame, a loss of honor so severe it could cripple a leader's standing and that of his entire clan. The spectacular totem poles that stood before longhouses were not merely art, they served as symbolic records of these events, depicting crests and stories that validated a family's history, status, and the agreements they had made. Tribal elders have described the potlatch as their law books, their courtrooms, and their parliaments, all rolled into one vibrant, living ceremony. This was an economy built on the currency of reputation, where generosity was a form of power and a spoken word, witnessed by the community and the ancestors, was the strongest bond imaginable. Can our own systems of contract law, buried in fine print, ever capture the profound human connection of an agreement sealed with a feast and a gift? The great temples of Sumer were not just houses of gods, but the central banks and administrative centers of the world's first cities. Within their walls, an entire economy hummed along on the spoken word of priests who acted as intermediaries for the divine. These temple complexes managed vast stores of grain, directed the labor of thousands, and oversaw long-distance trade, all through oral directives believed to carry the authority of the city's deity. A merchant did not need a written contract to secure a loan of barley. He needed only to swear a ritual oath before the temple priests, invoking the god's name as his guarantor. This system relied on a deeply ingrained trust in both the priesthood and the standardized measures they upheld. The same sized clay vessels for measuring grain were used in every transaction, their consistency a physical promise of fairness in a world without regulatory paperwork. How could such a complex operation keep track of its immense wealth? Before the advent of cuneiform writing, temple administrators used small, shaped clay tokens. Each unique token shape represented a specific quantity and type of good, from a jar of oil to a measure of wool. These tokens were stored in clay bulli or hollow balls that acted as three-dimensional records of debt and inventory, a tactile memory system sealed with the temple's mark. The rhythm of this entire economy was set by the moon. Priests used their oral knowledge of the lunar calendar to announce the optimal times for planting and harvesting, for settling debts, and for holding the great public festivals that were essential to economic life. During these festivals, the temple would redistribute food and goods to the populace, a practice that reinforced social norms and demonstrated the gods', and by extension the priesthood's, provision for the people. The young men trained as scribes learned far more than just how to eventually write. Their primary education was in the oral recitation of lists, measures, and liturgical texts, committing the entire economic and ritual structure to memory. To commit fraud against the temple was considered a direct offense against the god, a transgression punishable not by a prison sentence, but by the terrifying prospect of a divine curse that could blight one's family and fields. Can a system rooted so deeply in spiritual belief create a more honest society? The Sumerian temple economy suggests that when your business partner is a deity, your word becomes your most sacred currency, a principle that built the foundations of urban life itself. Isolated villages nestled in the valleys of feudal Japan possessed a quiet power, governing themselves for centuries without a single written statute. Their framework was the Mura, the village community itself, bound by unwritten customs known as Mura Hok. These were not laws imposed by a distant shogun, but principles of mutual aid and shared responsibility that everyone understood from childhood. The rhythm of life was set by the village assembly, a gathering of household heads who met to make the decisions that mattered most, from the critical distribution of irrigation water to the maintenance of paths and bridges. An elder's authority did not come from a title, but from a lifetime of experience and a flawless memory for precedent. How could a community ensure that a scarce resource like water was shared fairly among every family's rice paddy? They did not need a written manual, only the collective memory of the assembly, which would recall how disputes were resolved in a past drought, using that oral history to guide their present choices. These meetings were often timed with the seasons, aligning governance with the natural world, and their decisions were frequently sealed with a Shinto ritual. An agreement over land boundaries or water access would be validated at a local shrine, transforming a practical arrangement into a sacred vow witnessed by the kami, the spirits of the place. This spiritual layer gave the unwritten rules a profound weight, making their violation unthinkable. The ultimate goal was always wa or harmony, a state of social balance considered more important than any individual's victory. If a villager consistently broke the community's trust, the sanction was not imprisonment, but mura hachibu, a form of partial ostracism. The community would cease all but the most essential assistance, leaving the offender to face life's hardships largely alone. In a society built on interdependence, this was a devastating penalty. Can a system that prioritizes local knowledge and face-to-face consensus outperform a distant, centralized government? The Mura system's incredible resilience, lasting through wars and shifting regimes, suggests that sometimes the most effective rules are the ones never written down, but lived and breathed by everyone in the village. A desert is not an empty space when it is woven with song. For the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, the entire continent was a living legal text, its pathways and landmarks encoded into rhythmic verses known as songlines. These were not mere melodies, but intricate oral maps that charted vast distances, dictated resource rights, and governed social conduct through the stories of the Dreamtime. An elder, serving as the custodian of these songs, could navigate from one waterhole to the next across hundreds of miles by reciting the ancestral verses that described the creation of each rock and river. The song was both a map and a deed, a spiritual guide and a legal document, all held in memory. How could a society ensure that a stranger from a distant tribe could travel safely through another's territory? The answer lay in the kinship obligations woven directly into the songlines. A traveler would sing the verses that connected them to the ancestral beings of that land, effectively announcing their lineage and their rite of passage through a shared spiritual inheritance. This oral framework prevented conflict and managed scarce resources with profound wisdom. Ceremonial performances were not just cultural events, they were the primary method for teaching and reinforcing these complex norms. Through dance and song, each new generation learned the sacred stories that dictated which plants could be harvested and when, which animals could be hunted, and the precise boundaries between tribal lands. The mnemonics were ingenious, using rhythm, rhyme, and the very landscape itself as a memory palace. A particular sequence of notes might correspond to a specific turn in a canyon, while the name of an ancestor in the verse would point to a hidden spring. To disrespect a songline by, for instance, taking water from a forbidden source or hunting in a sacred area, was not just a social violation. It was a spiritual transgression that was believed to disrupt the very fabric of the Dreamtime, inviting consequences that could affect the entire community, from drought to sickness. This system created a form of oral cartography so precise that European explorers were often baffled by the ability of Aboriginal guides to traverse featureless deserts they had never physically seen, guided only by the songs they had learned. As one Aboriginal elder explained, "The land is a story, and we are its singers." Can any written law capture the depth of that connection, where every action is tied to an ancestral story, and every journey is a recitation of creation? The songlines represent a framework where law, geography, and spirituality are one inseparable whole, a testament to a legal system sung into existence. The volcanic plains of Thingvellir echoed with the voices of 1,000 free farmers, their annual assembly a defiant experiment in speech-based democracy. Here, the Icelandic Althing convened not in a grand hall, but in a natural amphitheater, a parliament of the people governed solely by memory. For 2 weeks each summer, this gathering became the legislative, judicial, and social heart of the nation, all without a single written law to guide it. The central figure was the law speaker, a man elected for his prodigious memory, tasked with reciting 1/3 of the entire legal code from the law rock during each assembly. His voice was the living constitution, a recitation that ensured every free man knew the rules by which they were bound. Norse scholars point to this oral framework as a powerful check on tyranny, for no chieftain could claim power above the law when the law itself resided in a shared, spoken tradition accessible to all. How did a society settle a bitter property dispute under such a system? A plaintiff would formally announce his case before the assembled crowd, his argument woven with the precise legal phrasing he had memorized. The proceedings were a masterclass in oral procedure, where the burden of proof often fell on oath helpers, groups of neighbors who would swear to the truth of a claim, their collective word carrying the force of evidence. This reliance on public oath-taking made personal reputation the bedrock of the entire legal process. The art of persuasion was paramount, and here the skaldic poets found their place in the courtroom. Their complex verse, rich with metaphor and kennings, was not merely entertainment. A well-crafted poem could summarize a complex legal precedent or sway public opinion through its elegant and memorable delivery, turning legal rhetoric into a performance that resonated with the assembly's sense of justice and honor. The very location of the Althing was a strategic choice for neutrality. Thingvellir, situated on the boundary between major clans, was considered a sacred space of truce where weapons were restricted and all participants were guaranteed safe passage. This neutral ground was essential for fostering the debate and consensus that the system required. Enforcement, however, remained a decentralized matter. There was no police force to carry out a verdict. Instead, the ruling of the Althing was backed by the threat of social ostracism, or, if that failed, the ever-present specter of a blood feud. A man declared an outlaw lost all legal protection, meaning anyone could harm him without consequence, a sentence that often meant death or exile. This framework of oral law and communal enforcement created a society where every individual was both a subject of the law and its guardian. Can a modern legislature, buried in thousands of pages of unread statutes, capture the raw, democratic power of a law that every citizen must hear and remember? The Althing stands as a monumental reminder that the voice of the people, when gathered in common purpose, can be the most resilient framework of all. A merchant's word was his most valuable asset in the bustling Karum trade ports of ancient Anatolia. These Assyrian merchant colonies thrived on unwritten commercial codes that stretched across vast distances, connecting Mesopotamia to the wider world through a framework built entirely on trust and reputation. A deal for a shipment of tin or fine textiles was not finalized with a signed contract, but with a verbal pledge made before a group of respected witnesses. Your family's good name and your future trading rights were the only collateral you needed. The entire system was managed by powerful caravan leaders who acted as traveling arbiters, their authority recognized in every Karum from Ashur to Kanesh. They settled disputes based on customary practices everyone understood, their judgments enforced not by courts but by the threat of collective boycott. A merchant who defaulted on a debt or delivered poor quality goods would find himself shut out of the network, his reputation shattered and his business finished. How could such a diffuse system prevent fraud without a central authority? The answer was woven into the very tools of the trade. Merchants used intricately carved cylinder seals, rolling them onto clay tablets to mark shipments and authenticate agreements. This seal was more than a signature. It was a symbolic guarantee of your honor, a unique identifier that carried the weight of your entire familial network. Every transaction was also sealed with a religious oath, invoking the gods as witnesses to the spoken terms. To break your word was not merely a business misstep, it was a sacrilege, an offense that risked divine displeasure alongside commercial ruin. This integration of the spiritual with the commercial created a powerful psychological deterrent against dishonesty. Can our modern world of dense legal fine print and faceless corporations learn from a system where a handshake and a spoken vow could move tons of metal and cloth across continents? The Karum networks prove that the most complex economies can be built on the simple, profound foundation of a trusted promise. The clamor of the bell echoed through the streets of Novgorod, a call to assembly that every free man recognized. This was the Veche, the beating heart of governance in Kievan Rus, a direct democracy where the collective voice of the people, not the solitary decree of a prince, held the ultimate power. Citizens would gather in the main square, their debates rising in a chorus of shouted acclamations and passionate arguments over matters of war, peace, and justice. The prince, though a powerful figure, was not an absolute ruler. Ancient chronicles record that even mighty leaders were compelled to consult the Veche on critical decisions, their authority checked by this vocal institution. The system operated entirely on an oral tradition of customary law, where the memory of past assemblies and their verdicts served as the only legal code. How could such a boisterous gathering possibly reach a clear decision? The answer lay not in a formal vote count, but in the volume and unity of the shouts from the crowd, a roaring consensus that signaled the will of the people. Wealthy boyar families often acted as influential voices in these debates, using their social standing to steer the discussion. Yet they could not simply impose their will against the unified cry of the common citizens. The entire process was a masterclass in communal memory, with elders reciting precedents from earlier conflicts to guide the assembly's judgment. This framework proved its resilience during the Mongol invasions, when it was the Veche in cities like Kiev and Vladimir that rallied the citizens, organizing the defenses and mobilizing the militias against the invading horsemen. The informal and flexible nature of this system allowed it to adapt to crises in real time, without the delay of written decrees or bureaucratic approval. Can you hear the echoes of that public square where every man had a direct stake in the fate of his city? The Veche stands as a powerful, if often overlooked, testament to a time when the law lived not on parchment, but in the shared voice of the community, a fleeting yet formidable power summoned by the ringing of a bell. The annual inundation of the Nile was the only calendar the nomarchs needed. In the provinces of Old Kingdom Egypt, these regional governors wielded authority not from a written legal code, but through spoken directives issued in the pharaoh's name and a deep reverence for Mot, the principle of cosmic order and truth. This concept was the invisible framework that structured every aspect of life, from the distribution of irrigation water to the resolution of a property dispute. A nomarch's court was not a place of litigation, but of declaration where he would listen to testimony and then pronounce a verdict intended to restore balance, his words considered an expression of divine harmony itself. Egyptologists describe Mot as a social and ethical compass, a force that demanded truthfulness, fairness, and respect for tradition from every official. Their training was a rigorous oral education, where aspiring scribes and administrators memorized vast bodies of instruction on proper conduct, learning to govern by internalizing the spoken wisdom of their predecessors rather than by consulting a law book. The rhythm of governance was inextricably tied to the river. The nomarch's most critical duty was organizing the communal labor for maintaining canals and dikes, his oral decrees coordinating thousands of hands to harness the flood's life-giving potential. This was a system built on foresight and collective effort, all managed through spoken commands. Grand public festivals were where these norms were most powerfully proclaimed. During the Opet festival or the Heb-Sed Jubilee, the pharaoh and his nomarchs would perform rituals that visually reinforced their role as upholders of Mot, their public speeches and ceremonies serving as a living reaffirmation of the social contract for all to witness. The entire framework was self-reinforcing through the belief in divine judgment. A corrupt official who hoarded grain during a famine was not just stealing from his neighbors, he was committing a cosmic offense against Mot. The expected punishment was not merely an earthly penalty, but a spiritual unraveling, a belief that the gods would ensure his downfall and the ruin of his lineage. This profound faith created a powerful incentive for moral leadership. When the Nile's flood was low and famine threatened, the nomarch would oversee the emergency redistribution of grain from temple granaries, an act of stewardship that was both a practical necessity and a sacred duty. His authority rested on the community's trust that he would act in accordance with Mot, putting the balance of the whole above his own personal gain. How many modern leaders could claim their authority is rooted in such a universal and ethical principle? The Nomarchies demonstrate that a society can achieve remarkable stability and longevity by weaving its governance into the very fabric of the cosmos, where a spoken word aligned with truth carries the weight of eternity. Deep in the northeastern woodlands, a powerful League of Nations proved that a spoken constitution could bind people together for centuries. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, often called the Iroquois, was governed by the Great Law of Peace, an oral framework so sophisticated it established a democracy with intricate checks and balances long before European contact. This was not a system of commands from a king, but a web of relationships and responsibilities spoken into being. At its heart were the clan mothers, respected elder women who held the authority to nominate and even remove the male leaders, known as sachems. These leaders were chosen for their peace-minded wisdom and their commitment to the people, not for their wealth or ambition. How could such a vast political union function without a written document? The answer was woven from shells and memory. Complex wampum belts with their intricate patterns of purple and white beads served as mnemonic devices, physical representations of the law's articles and the treaties made under its authority. A speaker would hold a belt while reciting the corresponding part of the Great Law, the pattern guiding his memory through the precise wording of clauses that ensured justice and peace. The entire system was designed for consensus, not majority rule. In the Grand Council fires, representatives from the 5, and later 6, nations would debate issues until they reached unanimous agreement, a process that could take days or even weeks, but which ensured that every voice was heard and no single nation could dominate the others. The process for amending this living constitution was equally deliberate, requiring a series of council meetings and a profound commitment to the collective good. The law's language was rich with metaphor, often drawing from the natural world to explain complex governance. Leaders were described as trees providing shade for the people, and the Confederacy itself was a longhouse stretching across the territories, with each nation having its own fire but sharing one common roof. This framework integrated environmental stewardship directly into its core principles, instructing leaders to consider the impact of their decisions on the 7th generation to come. Can our modern governments, so often focused on short-term gains, claim such a legacy-minded vision? The effectiveness of this oral system was proven in treaty negotiations with European powers, where Haudenosaunee diplomats, guided solely by the recitation of the Great Law, engaged as equals with foreign crowns. The condolence ceremony, a ritual for mourning dead leaders and installing new ones, was a key part of this political process, using prescribed speeches to wipe away grief and clear the eyes and ears of new sachems so they could see and hear the truth for their people. This was a governance model that wove together the feminine and the masculine, the human and the natural, the past and the future into a single, resilient whole. It stands as a monumental achievement of political philosophy, a testament to the fact that the most enduring frameworks are those spoken from a place of shared purpose and etched not onto paper, but into the heart of a culture. The echo of the temple administrator's voice found its way into the heart of the city, into the single-roomed buildings known as the Adaba, the tablet house. Here, the next generation of scribes did not simply learn to write, they learned to remember. Their education was a rigorous oral training, a mental conditioning to become living repositories of the very customs that held their society together. Before a student ever pressed a stylus into wet clay, He spent years reciting legal principles, standardized accounting lists, and complex hymns, committing the entire unwritten framework of Sumerian governance to memory. A mistake in recitation was not merely an academic error, it was a failure to uphold the tradition itself, met with swift correction from the school's father, the Amir. This was education as a sacred duty where the student's mind was the primary clay tablet. The curriculum was steeped in practicality. Young men memorized vast lists of commodities, from types of wood to qualities of wool, and the customary rates of exchange for each. They internalized legal precedents for everything from inheritance disputes to breach of contract, learning the spoken formulas that would one day allow them to mediate a conflict between two merchants in the marketplace. Their role was not to invent new laws, but to be flawless conduits for the old ones, ensuring that the same norms that guided their grandfathers would guide their own judgments. To teach ethics and sharpen their wits, students were drilled in thousands of proverbs, concise sayings that compressed generations of wisdom into a single, memorable line. A proverb like "a loving heart builds the home, a hating heart destroys it" was not just a moral lesson, it was a foundational principle for social harmony that a scribe might later invoke to counsel a feuding family. The penalty for a professional error in later life was not a fine, but a far more devastating professional disgrace, a loss of honor that could end a career, because the entire system was built on the absolute reliability of the scribe's spoken and written word. Upon graduation, these scribes did not vanish into dusty archives. They became essential advisors to the city's rulers, the Ensi. When the Ensi needed to know the customary share of the harvest owed to the temple, he consulted a scribe. When a complex trade agreement with a distant city was being negotiated, the scribe was there to recite the proper oral formulas and seal the deal with his stylus. They were the human infrastructure that allowed a complex urban society to function with consistency, bridging the emerging world of written records with the ancient, trusted world of the spoken oath. How much of our own modern education is dedicated to such deep internalization of our shared principles? The Adaba reminds us that the first step to upholding the law is not writing it down, but ensuring it is written indelibly upon the heart and mind of every guardian of justice. High in the Atlas Mountains, the voice of the Jama assembly carried the law across stone and sky. Amazing communities thrived for centuries under the canon, a body of unwritten customary rules that wove honor, hospitality, and a deep respect for the land into a single binding fabric. In these village gatherings, every adult man had the right to speak, and elders would resolve disputes by citing ancestral precedents from memory, their debates a living legal library. The system was a masterful adaptation to an arid world. Anthropologists note that canon included strict provisions for the shared use of water springs and the protection of communal forests, ensuring that scarce resources were never exhausted. A ritual known as the Elfatha sealed agreements, a ceremonial handshake accompanied by a spoken vow that wove the personal honor of the participants into an unbreakable bond. The history of these decisions and the lineage of the families involved were not written in books but preserved in the epic poetry of oral bards who transformed legal precedents into memorable verses. Over time, Islamic principles were seamlessly integrated into this ancient framework, with local imams often participating in the Jama'ah to help interpret how new spiritual concepts aligned with traditional custom. Justice here was restorative, not purely punitive. The penalty for theft, for instance, was typically not imprisonment, but full restitution of the stolen goods, plus an additional symbolic amount to publicly repair the breach of trust. This system of honor even enabled the vast trans-Saharan trade networks. A caravan leader from a distant oasis could negotiate safe passage and trade terms with a mountain community based solely on the shared understanding of canon. His word trusted because the entire economic network relied on the integrity of these spoken agreements. Can a legal framework that bends to the needs of a harsh environment be more resilient than one carved in stone? The enduring legacy of the Berber Kanun suggests that the most durable laws are those spoken by a community for a community, shaped not by a distant authority but by the very land they are sworn to protect. A king's word was not merely a command but a force of nature itself. In the sun-baked city-states of early Mesopotamia, rulers like the legendary Gilgamesh of Uruk governed through oral decrees believed to be divinely inspired. Their proclamations were not written laws, but living utterances delivered from the temple steps, carrying the absolute authority of the gods they served. The entire social order was reinforced through grand public rituals where the king, acting as the intermediary between the divine and mortal realms, would announce his judgments and decrees. Priests stood beside him, interpreting his words as binding law, a direct expression of the will of the pantheon. The epic tales of these rulers served as powerful mythological narratives that justified societal norms. When the Epic of Gilgamesh recounts the king's journey and his friendship with Enkidu, it is not just a story, it is a cultural lesson on leadership, mortality, and the proper relationship between a ruler and his people. These stories were recited publicly, embedding the framework of governance into the very identity of the citizens. The timing of these legal pronouncements was often tied to the heavens. Ceremonial decree announcements were synchronized with astronomical events like the solstices or the movements of certain planets, moments believed to be especially potent with divine energy. This integration made the law feel like a part of the cosmic order, as immutable as the stars themselves. A debt forgiveness edict, for instance, might be proclaimed during a major festival, an act of royal grace that was both an economic reset and a powerful demonstration of the king's godlike generosity. Enforcement relied heavily on the sanctity of the oath. To swear an oath to the king's decree was to swear directly to the gods, and the penalty for disobedience was not just a worldly punishment. Transgressors faced ritual purification or even exile, a cleansing necessary to remove the spiritual stain of their defiance and restore the community's favor with the deities. This system created a form of charismatic authority where the ruler's personal power and perceived divine connection were the ultimate guarantors of order. Can the force of a single voice, believed to be touched by the divine, hold a city together more effectively than a library of stone tablets? The God-King decrees of Mesopotamia reveal a framework where law was a performance of faith, and the most powerful rules were those spoken with the conviction of heaven itself. The vast Pacific Ocean was not a barrier, but a network of highways mapped entirely in memory. Polynesian navigators, known as wayfinders, guided their double-hulled canoes across thousands of miles using a framework of oral codes that governed everything from travel to trade. Their law was not written on parchment but charted in the stars, felt in the swell of the waves, and recited in rhythmic chants passed down through generations. These navigators trained in strict schools of memory, learning to recognize subtle shifts in ocean currents, the specific flight paths of homing birds, and the precise positions of constellations that served as celestial signposts. A master wayfinder's knowledge was a living atlas, a complex system of oral geographies that allowed him to pinpoint remote islands with astonishing accuracy. When two voyaging canoes met on the open sea, their interaction was governed by unwritten protocols. They would exchange kinship terms, establishing a relational framework that dictated the rules of engagement, whether for sharing fresh water, trading goods, or requesting landing rights on a foreign shore. These spoken agreements, sealed with ceremonial gift-giving, were as binding as any written treaty because the entire system relied on mutual survival and the preservation of one's sacred reputation. The navigational codes seamlessly integrated ecological signs into legal boundaries. A particular coral reef or a specific seabird nesting ground might mark the edge of a clan's fishing territory, its significance taught through oral tradition. To violate these boundaries was to risk more than social scorn. The penalty could be complete isolation, a refusal of aid that meant certain death in the open ocean. On islands like Easter Island, this oral framework managed incredibly scarce resources. The distribution of stone, timber, and access to coastal fishing grounds was regulated through lineages and chants that remembered who had rights to what and when. Can our modern world of GPS and signed contracts comprehend the depth of knowledge required to navigate both the sea and society by memory alone? These navigation codes demonstrate a world where the law was not a document to be consulted, but a living knowledge system sung into being, a framework that turned the endless blue expanse into a connected, governed community. A royal messenger carried no written treaty, only the sworn word of his king and the weight of sacred oaths. Across the Bronze Age Near East, from Egypt to Mesopotamia, sprawling networks of city-states maintained a delicate peace through alliances spoken into existence. The Amarna letters reveal a world where diplomacy was a performance of trust, conducted by heralds who acted as living legal agents. Their memory was the archive, their eloquence the binding clause. A herald arriving at a rival court would recite his master's message verbatim, then seal the agreement not with a signature, but with a ceremonial handclasp and a vow sworn in the name of their respective gods. This personal bond between rulers was the true foundation of the alliance, a framework where your word was your most valuable geopolitical asset. To solidify these spoken pacts, kings engaged in a constant exchange of lavish gifts, gold, ivory, and fine textiles, each item a tangible representation of goodwill and mutual obligation. A delayed or inferior return gift could be interpreted as a grave insult, potentially unraveling years of carefully negotiated trust. Marital alliances were the ultimate expression of this system, weaving royal families together through marriage. A princess sent to a foreign court was more than a bride. She was a living pledge of peace, her presence a daily reminder of the oath that now bound two kingdoms. The penalty for betraying such an oath was severe and collective. If one city-state broke its word, a coalition of allied powers could form to enforce the agreement, isolating the offender through a coordinated embargo or, if necessary, military action. This was international law upheld by the threat of collective memory and shared honor. Can our modern world of densely worded, often ignored, treaties learn from a system where a handshake and a spoken vow could maintain peace for a generation? These oral alliances demonstrate that sometimes the most resilient frameworks are not filed in archives, but forged in the personal trust between those who hold power. Deep within the Amazon, the humidity itself seems to listen when the tribal council speaks. Here, governance is a conversation woven into the sounds of the forest, where elders and shamans guide their people through oral deliberation rooted in ancient myth and shared vision. In communities like the Yanomami, major decisions are not made by a single chief, but through lengthy discussions in the central Shabono, a circular communal dwelling where every adult has a voice. The goal is always consensus, a deep and genuine agreement that maintains the social fabric and the delicate balance with the surrounding ecosystem. An ethnographer once noted that for these societies, the forest is a living relative, not a warehouse of resources, a perspective that inherently fosters profound sustainability. Their legal principles are drawn directly from this relationship, with intricate plant knowledge dictating harvesting rules. Certain medicinal trees can only be used by specific lineages, and the locations of vital groves are protected secrets, passed down orally to prevent overexploitation. This framework seamlessly blends the spiritual with the practical. Elders often interpret their own dreams or the visions received by shamans during sacred rituals as guidance for the community. A powerful dream about a river spirit might lead to a council decree that fishing in a certain tributary is forbidden for a season, allowing the stocks to recover. How do you make such a decree stick without written laws or police? The entire community becomes the enforcer through ritual and shared belief. Agreements reached in council are physically reinforced through ceremonial dances, where the rhythmic movements and chants act as a public, physical ratification of the decision, etching it into collective memory. When conflict does arise, the system focuses on restoration, not punishment. A dispute between families, perhaps over a hunting ground, is resolved in a restorative circle. The entire community gathers, and each person speaks, not to assign blame, but to uncover the root of the harm and weave the social fabric back together. The offending party might be tasked with a specific community service, like helping to build a new section of the Shabono, a tangible act that repairs the damage and reaffirms their place in the group. This is holistic justice, where a broken relationship is seen as a sickness that requires healing for the entire body of the community. It challenges our own, often impersonal legal systems, asking us if true justice might be found not in a prison sentence, but in a circle of voices under the canopy, seeking to make each other whole again. The Phoenician merchant's word was his bond, sealed not by a signature but by a sacred oath sworn before his entire guild. In the bustling Iron Age ports of Tyre and Sidon, these powerful trade associations created a world of commerce that needed no written regulations. Their unwritten code governed every aspect of business, from the 7-year apprenticeship of a young craftsman to the precise quality of a batch of royal purple dye. Disputes were not taken to a king's court, but settled in the guild's own assembly, where elders would listen and then recite the customary rules from memory, delivering a verdict that everyone in the room was honor-bound to accept. Economic historians point to this as a masterclass in building trust networks, where reputation was a form of capital more valuable than gold. The initiation of a new member was a solemn ritual. A young man entering the Leatherworkers Guild, for instance, would swear a verbal oath of loyalty, pledging to uphold the guild's secrets and standards, his promise witnessed by every master craftsman. This ceremony wove him into a web of mutual obligation that defined his professional life. To authenticate their goods, guilds used unique symbolic marks, a potter's distinctive stamp or a metalworker's secret punch on a blade. These marks were not registered with any authority, yet they were instantly recognized across the Mediterranean, a silent guarantee of quality backed by the guild's collective honor. The entire business cycle was synchronized with religious festivals. The glassmakers of Sidon might begin their most important production run only after the annual festival to the god Melkart, weaving their commercial calendar into the fabric of their spiritual life. This integration made the guild's economic rules feel like a natural extension of divine order. What happened to a merchant who diluted his wine or used inferior materials? He faced no fine from a government inspector. The ultimate penalty was guild expulsion, a professional death sentence that meant no other member would trade with him, effectively ending his livelihood. This peer pressure was a far more effective deterrent than any written statute. We see this in action with informal price-fixing agreements. A group of textile merchants might verbally agree on a minimum price for linen, an arrangement enforced not by contract, but by the shared understanding that anyone who undercut the group would be shunned. Can our modern economy of anonymous corporations and complex regulations recapture the power of a system where your business partner was also your neighbor and your oath was your most valuable asset? The merchant guilds built their own legal universe through spoken promises, proving that a community bound by honor can be its own most effective governor. A druid's verdict was a song sung from the sacred grove. In the misty forests of ancient Gaul, the Celtic druids served as the living courts of their people, their oral judgments weaving natural law with the movements of the stars. These revered figures underwent decades of training in secluded woodland sanctuaries, committing vast legal precedents to memory through poetic verse. Their authority flowed not from written statutes, but from a perceived connection to the cosmic order itself. Julius Caesar himself noted their immense influence, writing that the Druids decided almost all public and private disputes, from boundary disagreements between tribes to accusations of murder. Their rulings were delivered in a rhythmic, formulaic language, a deliberate choice that transformed legal principles into unforgettable art. This poetic form ensured the judgment could be accurately recalled and repeated by the community, cementing its authority long after the Druid's voice had faded. How could a legal system integrate the very turning of the year? The Druidic calendar was a fundamental part of their framework. Major cases were often heard during specific festivals like Samhain or Beltane, times believed to be thin places between the human and spiritual worlds. This timing imbued the proceedings with a profound sense of gravity, as if the verdict itself was sanctioned by the shifting seasons. Before pronouncing a judgment, a druid might seek signs from the natural world, interpreting the flight patterns of birds or the entrails of a sacrificed animal as divine omens guiding his decision. This was law as a collaborative act between humanity and the cosmos. The penalties they issued were as much spiritual as they were social. For a serious offense like betraying a tribal oath, the punishment could be a ritual curse, a poetic declaration of exile that severed the offender from both the protection of the gods and the support of the community. In one legendary case, a bitter conflict over a stolen sacred cauldron threatened to erupt into a full-scale war between two tribes. The Druids from both sides convened at a neutral oak grove. After 3 days of deliberation and observation of the heavens, they delivered a complex poetic ruling that involved compensation in cattle and the reciprocal fostering of chieftains' sons, a judgment that wove the warring groups back into a relationship of obligation and peace. Can a legal system that looks to the stars for guidance hold a deeper wisdom than one confined to cold text? The Druidic judgments of Gaul challenge us to see law not as a human invention, but as a sacred discovery, a framework where justice was a verse waiting to be sung by those who knew how to listen to the world. The lifeblood of Mesopotamia flowed not just in its rivers, but through the voices of the Water Council. Along the intricate networks of canals feeding the fields, these councils of farmers and village elders gathered to perform a vital ritual, the oral allocation of water rights. There were no written laws dictating who received how much of the precious flow, only a deeply ingrained customary share remembered by the community. A senior elder, his memory shaped by a lifetime of seasons, would recite the traditional rotations, ensuring every family's plot received its fair turn at the irrigation ditch. This was a framework built on collective memory and a shared understanding of seasonal needs, a system that prevented countless conflicts over the most vital resource in an arid land. Hydrologists studying these ancient societies note that this oral governance was remarkably adaptive, allowing for real-time adjustments during a drought. When the river ran low, the council would convene urgently, its members debating and then collectively agreeing on a revised distribution plan, a temporary shift in the oral rules to ensure the entire community survived the hardship. The canal supervisor was more than a maintenance man, he was the chief arbiter. His word, based on the council's spoken decree, settled disputes at the water's edge, his authority respected because it represented the consensus of his peers. The entire process was steeped in a powerful water ethic drawn from the region's great flood myths. These stories, recited during council meetings, served as a constant reminder that water was a divine gift, not a personal possession, and that its fair sharing was a sacred duty. What happened to a farmer who secretly dammed a minor canal to steal a few extra hours of flow for his own field? He wasn't taken to a royal court. The penalty was social shaming, a devastating verdict delivered by his own neighbors. The council would publicly denounce his actions, and the resulting loss of honor and trust could cripple his family for generations. Can our modern, bureaucratic systems for managing water, with their miles of legal statutes, ever capture the elegant efficiency of a community that governs its most critical infrastructure through conversation and remembered tradition? The Mesopotamian water councils prove that the most complex resource management can thrive when the rules are carried not on paper, but in the living consensus of those who depend on them every day. A family's right to cultivate a plot of land was never written down, but was sung into being during the annual festival of the earth. In the high Andes, the Ainu wove kinship, labor, and faith into a single unbreakable cord of custom. Your identity and your responsibilities were defined by your place within this extended family, a collective that managed its territory and its survival through a living oral tradition. The governing principle was Aini, a sacred reciprocity that meant every gift of labor demanded a future return, creating a continuous cycle of mutual support that bound the community together. A leader, or Kuroka, was chosen not for his wealth, but for his fairness and his generous spirit, his moral authority proven through a lifetime of fulfilling his Aini obligations to others. Quechua oral traditions hold a saying that captures this essence: "If you do not sow, you will not eat," a simple phrase that carried the weight of a legal and spiritual doctrine. The system's brilliance lay in its rotational leadership. Different families would take turns managing communal resources, ensuring power was shared, and no single lineage could dominate the others. This prevented the concentration of authority and kept the framework responsive to everyone's needs. To support this complex web of obligations, the community used the quipu, a device of knotted strings. While not writing, its intricate patterns served as a tactile memory aid, helping administrators recall labor debts, harvest shares, and ritual calendars that were too vast to hold in a single mind. The sacred peaks, the apus, were considered living deities whose favor was essential for rain and fertility. The legal principles of the Ailu were thus directly tied to these mountain spirits. A decision about when to plant potatoes on a high slope was not just agricultural. It was a legal and religious act based on oral knowledge of the Apu's moods and the community's customary planting schedules. What happened to someone who consistently avoided their communal labor, who broke the chain of Aini? There were no formal courts to prosecute laziness. The penalty was a gradual but decisive reduction in community support. When his own roof needed repair or his field needed planting, fewer neighbors would arrive to help. This calibrated social pressure was a far more effective motivator than any written fine, as it directly impacted a family's ability to survive in the harsh alpine environment. The breathtaking terraces that staircase across the mountainsides are a monument to this system. Building and maintaining them required the coordinated labor of hundreds, all organized through oral agreements and the shared understanding of Aini. A family would contribute its labor to a terrace wall, knowing that in the future, the entire community would help them harvest the potatoes grown on the land they helped secure. Can our modern economies, so focused on individual profit, comprehend the resilience of a society that measured its wealth in the strength of its communal bonds? The Ilu stands as a profound testament to a world where the law was not owned, but collectively lived and spoken, a framework where every spoken agreement wove another thread into the fabric of a shared life. These unwritten frameworks did not appear overnight. They evolved over millennia, growing in sophistication alongside humanity itself. In the earliest hunter-gatherer bands, the rules were simple and immediate, focused on survival and group cohesion. A spoken agreement on how to share a large kill or a customary right to a particular foraging ground were the first kernels of law, passed down through generations around the campfire. As these bands settled into villages and began to farm, the rules had to adapt. Managing shared irrigation canals or settling disputes over stored grain required more complex oral traditions, giving rise to the village elders and their remembered precedents. The true test came with the rise of the first cities, where thousands of strangers had to coexist. It was here that oral frameworks reached their peak, developing intricate systems for trade, property, and conflict resolution without a single written statute, proving they were anything but primitive. So why did writing eventually take over? Anthropologists point to a combination of pressures. As populations swelled into the tens of thousands, the sheer number of transactions and disputes could overwhelm even the most gifted oral memory. A law speaker might remember the customs for 10,000 people, but for 100,000, the system began to strain. External invasions often delivered the final blow. Conquering empires with their own written legal codes would impose them upon oral cultures, as seen when Rome expanded into Celtic Gaul, systematically replacing the Druidic judgments with Roman law. Trade with distant, literate civilizations also created a need for permanent records that could travel, leading merchant guilds to gradually adopt written contracts for long-distance deals. Yet this transition was rarely a simple story of progress. In many cases, something profound was lost. A written law is fixed, but an oral tradition could breathe and adapt, changing subtly with each recitation to meet new circumstances. The shift to writing often centralized power, taking the law out of the hands of the community and placing it into the hands of scribes and kings who could now claim a single, unchangeable version. The frameworks we have explored were not replaced because they were inferior, but because they were ultimately overwhelmed by scale and external force. This historical pivot away from spoken law sets the stage for a pressing modern question. What have we, in our world of endless statutes and digital contracts, forgotten about the power of a spoken word and a community's shared memory? Yet the echoes of these 28 forgotten frameworks are not silent relics. They speak directly to our modern struggles with disconnection, bureaucratic sprawl, and a deep hunger for community. These ancient systems reveal that trust is not a soft ideal, but a practical infrastructure, one that can be deliberately built through shared experience and spoken agreement. Consider the pressing challenge of local decision-making today, where town hall meetings often dissolve into polarized shouting matches. The Haudenosaunee commitment to consensus or the Bantu Palaver's focus on restorative dialogue offer a different model, where the goal is not to win a debate but to weave a solution that the entire community can uphold. What if our local councils began their sessions not with Robert's Rules of Order, but with a circle where every voice was heard with the intention of finding a shared truth? We see glimpses of this in modern restorative justice programs, which move away from punitive sentencing and toward bringing victims and offenders together in a facilitated dialogue. aiming to repair harm rather than simply punish the offender, much like the holistic justice of the Amazonian Tribal Council. Our newest communities, those forming in digital spaces, are already unconsciously reviving these oral frameworks. Massive online games and social media platforms are governed not by written terms of service alone, but by constantly evolving, spoken norms of conduct enforced by community moderators and the collective judgment of users. These are the digital age's versions of the Thing Assembly or the Merchant Guild, where reputation and social sanction are the primary tools of governance. Could our cities integrate these principles on a larger scale? Community land trusts, where residents collectively steward affordable housing through shared agreements, function like a modern ILU, prioritizing community needs over individual profit through a framework of mutual obligation. The question these ancient systems pose to us is stark. Have we sacrificed too much human connection and adaptability for the cold certainty of written law? Is there a way to blend the consistency of a legal code with the warmth and flexibility of a community's living memory? Perhaps the future of governance lies not in more regulations, but in designing more spaces for meaningful conversation, where agreements are forged face to face and a handshake can once again carry the weight of a world. These 28 frameworks challenge us to rebuild the sinews of trust, suggesting that the most resilient rulebook might not be found in a library, but in the remembered promise between neighbors. From the crowded Mesopotamian market to the vast silence of the Pacific, these 28 forgotten frameworks reveal a stunning truth. Human societies have flourished under an incredible diversity of unwritten systems. Each one was a unique answer to the same fundamental question: how do we live together? They found their stability not in parchment or stone, but in the living pulse of oral tradition, the gentle yet unyielding pressure of social expectation, and the shared heartbeat of cultural values. Justice was not a distant abstraction, but a process owned by the community, whether spoken from the law rock of Iceland, woven into a Polynesian chant, or carved into the memory of a Celtic druid. These were not primitive attempts at order. They were sophisticated, adaptive, and deeply human systems that prove written laws are not the only path to a functioning society. They offer us a timeless lesson in resilience, showing that trust, forged through face-to-face agreement and mutual obligation, can be the most durable infrastructure of all. They challenge our modern reliance on cold text and distant authority, reminding us that community cohesion is built not through compliance, but through conversation. As one wise elder from an oral tradition once said, "A person is a person through other people. We are all connected by invisible threads of shared understanding." Which of these frameworks resonated most deeply with you? Do you see the echoes of unwritten rules, of social contracts and shared memories, quietly shaping the world you live in today? Share your thoughts and insights in the comments below, and if you are captivated by these historical mysteries, subscribe to continue the journey